Hey folks, my name is Amira Armond. I am an instructor for CMMC. I teach classes for Edwards Performance Solutions and also blog on cmmcaudit.org. I'm also the owner of Carry Solutions and authorized C3PAO. So the question keeps coming up. Do I have to buy Microsoft 365 GCC High for CMMC? So let's talk about that. It's a little bit nuanced. The answer is not yes. The answer is not no. It's nuanced. So first off, let's talk about this FedRAMP thing. If you go to fedramp.gov, which is the page I'm showing here, you can look up the program basics of FedRAMP, right? So why am I talking about FedRAMP? Well, defense contractors, as part of their contracts with the Department of Defense, basically all of the defense contractors have a clause in the contract that says, if you use a cloud service provider to store, process, or transmit controlled and classified information, you need to make sure that that cloud service provider is FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. Okay, so now we need to figure out what FedRAMP means. FedRAMP stands for the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. And it's, in layman's term, is a step-by-step process that cloud services can go through in order to be verified acceptable for the federal government to use them. Okay, note that I did not say defense contractors to use them. I definitely didn't say private companies to use them. I said the federal government to use the clouds. So think of a large cloud provider, AWS, Google, or there's lots of very specialized clouds that perform backups, or they perform endpoint management or logging or whatnot, right? When those clouds were first developed, almost all of them were intended for commercial use by private sector companies. Right, so they had programmers writing code, they tested it, they built servers, they built data centers, they got all this cool stuff working for whatever service that they provide, and they made it available to the private sector. And the private sector said, yay, this is awesome, right? We love it. We love clouds. And the government is over there going, man, I want to use that cloud too. But I can't, because I am legally required to make sure that cloud is very, very secure. And I have no way of telling how secure that cloud is. Right? The federal government is required to perform the security controls from NIST Special Publication 853, and there's like 1,000 potential controls that a government agency might need to apply, and they literally were not allowed to go to AWS or Google or Microsoft or whatever to use that cool cloud service, because there was no way for them to verify that that cloud was as secure as required for US government use. SOC 2s, not covering it, okay? SOC 2s are like maybe 10%. The ISO certifications, again, definitely less than 50%. So the government whined. They said, hey, I want to use that cool cloud stuff, right? I want to stop installing everything on premises. The private sector is doing cool stuff and we're not allowed to. So somebody said, well, why don't we set up a program where we will have private sector assessors called third-party assessment organizations, 3PAOs, go and verify that clouds are performing all of the security requirements of 853, specifically the moderate baseline, which is security controls that are just right from a Goldilocks standpoint, right? So they're not too little, they're not too much, they're just right. They're the moderate requirements. So in order for a cloud to get into this FedRAMP thing and be allowed to sell their services to the government, the first requirement is that it's truly a cloud, right? And most of us know what a cloud means, but essentially there's back-end code, right? There's logic, there's automation. It's not something where you call somebody, you have meetings with engineers, and then they build to order. That's not a cloud. A cloud is rapidly scalable, automated, self-service. You don't need to talk to somebody to spin up a server. So first off, it needs to be an actual cloud. No managed services here, okay? Second, it needs to perform a service that the government wants to use, because the only way that a cloud is allowed to get into this FedRAMP program is because a government agency wants to use the service. So if that service is dedicated to private sector, it simply can't do FedRAMP. It needs at least one government agency to say, I want to use you, right? It's that sponsorship process. Because remember, FedRAMP is meant for federal agencies to use that cloud, not defense contractors, definitely not private sector. So once this is all determined, typically what happens is that cloud provider will look at all the security controls that the government wants them to perform, and they go, wow, that's really expensive. That takes a lot of extra people, takes a lot of extra record keeping. Some of it's kind of silly, right? It's certainly not agile. And they say, you know what? I'm going to enclave this. Right? So yay for all you CMMC folks. Even the cloud people do enclaves. And what they do is they take their back-end code that they've been operating and providing to the commercial area for years, and they say, I'm going to pick up all that code, and all that logic that runs the servers, and I'm going to make a new set of servers with different staff who have different procedures, right? Much more stringent, much more careful procedures, who have a whole lot more compliance folks involved to do all those documentation and self-audits and risk assessments. And we're going to perform all these controls for this second enclave, and we're going to sell that enclave to federal agencies. Okay. So one of the things that I'm going to try and make sure everyone understands is, for any of these clouds, if they have a FedRAMP version, almost all of them will also have a commercial version. The commercial version may or may not be highly secure, right? It's probably pretty darn secure because it's a big cloud provider and they have budget to be secure. And if they got hacked, it would be very loud and bad, right? But we know that they're performing all of those 325 FedRAMP moderate controls or more on their FedRAMP version of cloud, which is almost always a separate build, right? Separate data center, separate admins, separate servers, same code, same backend code. So they build up an enclave just so that they can pass an assessment and so that they can provide services to the government. And so that they only have to pay those extreme extra costs for the government customers. They typically charge more for the FedRAMP version because, again, it's expensive to have all these extra people. They go through a third-party assessment by a third-party assessment organization, 3PAO, and they get the results of that assessment, which hopefully say they're doing almost everything, right? Maybe not everything. So that's the difference between FedRAMP and CMMC, where with FedRAMP, the assessors are allowed to say, you know what, this requirement's not applicable, right? Doesn't make sense. This cloud provider is not publishing information to a public website, right? So we're not going to worry about that one. Maybe they don't have media, not applicable, right? Or maybe they don't have VoIP, not applicable. They could also potentially fail a control, right? So the assessment could find that some things are not being performed, and they just write it down, say, you know what, I saw an issue, right? Not everything was labeled. Maybe all software was not authorized, or maybe the antivirus wasn't running on these servers. And the assessors don't make a judgment themselves. What they do is they send the audit report up to the government agency that wants to use the service. And that government agency looks at the report and goes, oh, good enough. We'll accept the risk. Right? Or maybe they don't, but most of the time they do. Because the reality of it is that every information system has stuff that's not working at any given time. And in most cases, even if a cloud has one or two things wrong with it, where they're not performing every control perfectly, they will still be doing better than if the government agency was running those services on-prem with the government patch schedules, for example. Okay. So they've got a third-party audit report. The government agency says, you know what, good enough for us, and they authorize the cloud to go up into FedRAMP. And I'm vastly simplifying this, so bear with me. There's a little bit more complexity. There's some different authorization paths, but it's basically government authorizes it for use by government. One of the other things that you'll see with FedRAMP versions is that they will always have their full system security plan and a shared responsibility matrix available to their customers, which is the government. So you can see what's going on and how they're addressing different controls. On the commercial side, you typically don't have that at all. Or if you're lucky, you'll have a shared responsibility matrix, right? Which might be very, very vague. Now, what FedRAMP does not tell us is, first off, where are the data centers, and who are the admins on the back end, right? So remember that this is a cloud service. It's just servers, right? It's just operating systems. It's probably mostly Linux. They're running on servers and storage area networks and networking and Cisco, right? Just the standard stuff that everyone else in the world uses. It probably costs more. It's probably very enterprise class, but it's real people using real servers, real networking equipment. And if you've been a system admin, you know that you can get into stuff, right? So I was a system admin for 20 years, and every network that I had admin rights to, I could get into the accounting data. I could see the sales information. I could see the HR records, right? You're an admin. That gives you the rights. And one of the big risks from using a cloud service is that even though you can't see it because that's opaque to you, you just see a nice, cool website with buttons you can click to do self-service. There are people on the back end who have access to your data, right? They can go into the servers and browse around the file system and look at stuff. And you have to understand that. We forget it, right? So when we're talking about putting CUI into a cloud, we have to think, who are the backend admins? Are they trustworthy for the type of CUI that I'm going to put there? Now, 853 does include controls which say perform screening of your personnel. Right? Make sure that if you have somebody that you want to hire to be an admin and they seem a little bit risky, right? They've got some DUIs, they've been murdering people on the side, don't give them a job. But 853 does not say hire only US citizens. It does not say only have data centers inside of the US. Okay, or if it does, it's at a high level, which is not the FedRAMP moderate level that most clouds are striving to reach, right? So you can absolutely have a FedRAMP moderate cloud that is based out of India, Pakistan, Turkey, somewhere else, right? That's not US. You can have a FedRAMP moderate cloud, which is staffed by, administrated by non-US persons. And that's okay for CUI, mostly, right? So this is where we get into that statement that we keep hearing over and over again. I was told by a salesperson that I have to get GCC High in order to pass CMMC. No. Okay. What that salesperson should have been telling you is that if you're going to store CUI in a cloud, that cloud needs to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. I'll get more into that equivalent in a second. And if you are going to store export controlled CUI, which is a subcategory of CUI, right? Not all controlled and classified information is export controlled. Then you need to make sure that the cloud that you're going to put it on meets the requirements for export controlled, which is US persons are doing the administration and the data centers are in the US. Right? But there's only a small percentage of CUI that is export controlled. So for most CUI, right, if we're thinking about privacy records, health records, financial data, critical infrastructure information, building schematics, right? Those are not export controlled types of CUI. You are allowed to store them in a FedRAMP cloud in India using India's support. That's okay. All right. You still have to make sure the personnel are trustworthy, that their background screened, but they do not have to be US persons. When we start talking about ITAR, though, right, arms data, weapon schematics, fighter jets, that is export controlled almost entirely. And you do need to make sure that the cloud that you choose is US person on the back end, that the storage location is in the US. And FedRAMP doesn't actually necessarily tell us that, at least at the FedRAMP moderate level. You have to verify that on a per cloud basis, right? So, hey, Google, is your data center in the US? Do you store data in other countries, right? Is there any way that a non-US citizen could get access to it from the back end? The next thing that FedRAMP does not tell us is whether security controls are performed to protect anything except for the back end, right? So when we look at the different types of cloud services, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, there are radically different levels of security provided by the cloud for each of these types of services. For software as a service, the cloud is obligated to do stuff like antivirus scanning to protect its systems. Network protections, firewalls, patching, right? A software as a service looks like a website, essentially, that you use, right? So all the stuff that they would do to make that website secure is on the cloud. However, when you get down to infrastructure as a service, well, that's where you're creating virtual machines and virtual networks inside of basically a virtualized hardware environment that's provided by the cloud, right? So the cloud provides you the servers, the memory, the CPU, the raw network capabilities. But everything past that is on you, right? So if you build up a virtual firewall and you don't configure it right, that's on you. They are not performing security for that firewall. If you build a server and you connect it to the internet directly and you don't patch it, that's on you. They are not performing security for that server, right? So you can't just say, oh, it's a FedRAMP cloud, and I can put all of my virtual computing resources up on it, and they're going to do it all for me, right? That's not a statement that's safe to say. You have to actually check with the cloud to see what they're doing and what their service level is, their support level is, and probably read their system security plan and shared responsibility matrix to see exactly what they do on a per control basis. Hot tip, pro tip, most clouds don't do a whole lot to secure anything except for their cloud, right? So if they're not fully in charge of it, if they did not build it themselves and deliver it to you, it's probably on you to secure. And then the last thing that FedRAMP does not tell us is whether the provider will help with incident forensics as required by that DFARS clause that we talked about at the very beginning, right? So all the DoD defense contractors have a clause in their contracts that says, you know, not only you have to use a FedRAMP cloud for CUI, but it also says that you have to flow down this contract to your providers. And part of the contract says, if you have a cyber incident, you have to help the Department of Defense with forensics, meaning that they could show up and say, I need that server. I need you to power down that server and give it to me. I need you to create full images of everything involved and give it to us. That's expensive, right? Could you imagine? I know of companies, you know, defense contractors that have had an incident who have had to shut down servers that they needed to run their business so that the DoD could do forensics on it. I've certainly heard of defense contractors that had to take computers and cell phones from their employees because there was a spillage, right? Goodbye, computer. I guess you can't work until we get you a new one, right? There's, again, nothing in 853 that says that the cloud provider agrees to help with DFARS incident forensics. That's a different thing. That's a separate agreement between you and the cloud provider. And you actually have to go check with the clouds to see if they agree to that on a one-to-one basis, right? So not every FedRAMP cloud will support this DFARS requirement. Okay, so what is FedRAMP equivalent? Lots of people have been complaining on the CMMC side that the Department of Defense is not clear enough about what FedRAMP equivalent means, right? There's this thing in our contracts to say we have to use a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent cloud. What does FedRAMP equivalent mean? And while what I'm going to say is not official, right? You can go look up the DFARS Cyber FAQ, which tries to explain it. The CMMC rule tries to explain it. Essentially, if I understand correctly, the way the Department of Defense views FedRAMP equivalent means they're doing all the security controls, right? So remember that third-party audit report showing that all the 300 plus controls from 853 are performed? And also that the system security plan and shared responsibility matrix are available for review. Right. I think it's pretty safe to say that that's what FedRAMP equivalent means. So the part that's not FedRAMP, which made them say equivalent, is that they realized that not every cloud would be a cloud that a government agency wants to use. Right? Not every cloud would be eligible for the FedRAMP program because the federal government doesn't want to use it. But they still want defense contractors to use secure clouds. So they said, has to be FedRAMP equivalent. Right? So, and this is pretty well backed up by the text from the DFARS Cyber FAQ, which is available from the procurement toolbox. It basically says, hey, you need to go look at that cloud and using methods that you would normally perform for anything else to verify that they're actually performing security, determine that they're doing all the security. right? Equivalent to 853 moderate baseline, which for most of us means getting a third-party audit report saying that they are doing it. All right. What FedRAMP equivalent does not mean is not performing security, right? Though for some reason, a lot of clouds that are not performing security think that that's what it means, right? They're not doing all of the requirements, but they're like, I'm equivalent, right? And don't ask for a third-party audit report because you don't need one, because I don't have to do the FedRAMP program. I'll just tell you I'm equivalent, right? That's not good. FedRAMP equivalent means doing all the requirements. All right. So let's talk about Microsoft a little bit. This is my best explanation as an instructor. Bear with me. I'm trying to educate, and I might not be perfect. So you can actually go to a blog post by Microsoft, which explains the different cloud tiers and whether or not they should be used for different types of data. And I will link that blog post in the comments of this video. But essentially, we can see this standard FedRAMP progression from private sector to federal government for Microsoft, right? Which is a very popular cloud service that lots of people like to use. Okay. So when Microsoft first started offering Office 365, they wrote their back-end code for commercial. And the back-end administrators and the data centers are across the world, right? International. The personnel are screened, they are trustworthy, but they're not US citizens necessarily, right? And because incident forensics in the event of a cyber incident is expensive, right? The DoD could walk in and seize servers potentially, or tell you to shut down servers. Microsoft says we don't support the incident forensics clause of DFARS for commercial. Commercial is priced super cheap, so don't ask us to do that, right? If you want incident response support for the DoD, then buy a more expensive version of the same thing called Government Community Cloud. So Government Community Cloud, they still are international, but it's compliant with DFARS incident forensics. You can store most types of CUI on Government Community Cloud because these are, I forgot to mention, all of these are actually FedRAMP. Right. So if I remember correctly, commercial and GCC are FedRAMP moderate baseline, and GCC High is FedRAMP high baseline. Right. So if you look at the Goldilocks, low, medium, and high, commercial and GCC are at that medium level, which is a nice level of security for federal government. And GCC High is at that high level, which is very strong security for the most secure applications of government data. So Microsoft's blog article basically says if you have regular CUI that's not export controlled, if it's not ITAR, go ahead, you can use GCC for it. If you have ITAR data, if you have export controlled data, then you really should be using GCC High because the administrators and the data centers are US only, right? Which is appropriate for export controlled data. GCC High is also compliant with DFARS incident forensics, right? If need be, they absolutely will let the DoD come in and look at their servers, look at their network. GCC High, to my understanding, can be used to store any CUI type. There's a question here about nuclear, because nuclear has some legal requirements to say you can only share it with people who are authorized to be shared with by the government. And you probably want to double check with the government whether or not you can use GCC High in that case. But overall, GCC High, according to Microsoft, is appropriate for ITAR data, export controlled data, right? So you can see what I mean, that just because something is FedRAMP, it doesn't mean that supports the DFARS incident forensics. It doesn't mean that the admins are in the US, right? Because commercial is FedRAMP moderate. It just means that it's performing all of those security controls from 853. And we can say that each one of these has been third-party assessed to be performing those 325 security controls, and that they have shared responsibility matrix and system security plans available to their customers. So coming back to the original question, do I need to use GCC High to pass CMMC? No. Nope. Not at all, right? Super wrong, super misleading. If anybody tells you that, they're bad. It should be a nuanced conversation, right? If you have CUI and you want to put it on a cloud, that cloud needs to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, primarily meaning that 120 security controls from the FedRAMP moderate baseline as verified by a third-party assessor, right? And then also that supports the DFARS incident forensics requirements. And then based on the type of CUI that you have, you might need to use a cloud that guarantees its personnel and its data centers are in the United States, right? If you have export controlled CUI, which is not all CUI. But there's plenty of cloud providers that meet all that. You can go to the FedRAMP marketplace and look up the list of cloud providers. FedRAMP, click on the marketplace tab, and you can scroll down the list and pick which cloud provider you're interested in. For example, AWS, their GovCloud offering is FedRAMP High, and if I remember correctly, it's US persons, US data for that tier of service. There's other highs, right, which may or may not be US. Got to double check. They may or may not support that incident forensics, you got to check. But there's lots of alternatives to GCC High. That's not the only one. It's just a very popular one. So I hope that clears it up. I hope that we can get away from this question because I've heard it 100 times now. And, you know, if the salesperson tells you that you have to go to GCC High or you're going to fail, that's a bad sign. They are bad, right? That's misleading, inaccurate information. All right. Cheers.